Well, hello, everybody. I'm Matt Meyer with FNBO's corporate banking team, and thanks for joining us today for this edition of FNBO's Business Insights and our discussion on managing cash flow. For those that haven't joined us in the past, Business Insights is a webinar series that we've developed here at FNBO to provide perspectives, insights, and thoughts from FNBO leadership and subject matter experts. And with that, I'm incredibly excited today to be joined by three phenomenal guests, B.C. Krishna, founder and CEO of Centime Inc., Dorothy Cobb, founder and CEO of DK East Associates, Todd Murphy, CEO of Universal Information Services. And before we kick off our conversation with our guests on some of the experiences that they've had in managing cash flow, I want to provide a little bit of background on FNBO's relationship with BC and Centime, which really is a relationship that's been born out of our mission to be a customer-led organization. For us, being customer-led means providing solutions and products and advice and guidance that support and empower our customers to control their financial well-being. And with that, the solutions we develop start with understanding the goals of our customers and the issues that they might face in attaining them. And the development of these solutions has often required us to find the very best partners in the fintech space to integrate new technology into the customer relationships that we're so fortunate to be a part of. And BC, while I think on its surface, the existence of banks and fintechs could create some natural friction, I also think that what makes us different is what makes us great partners. And if I think about things from my own experience as a banker here at FNBO and some of the entrepreneurs that I've been fortunate enough to work with over the years, there's some similarities there in that as a banker, I was born cynical and pessimistic and annoyingly detailed, and working with entrepreneurs helps balance all that out. And so I think the relationship between banks and fintechs can be somewhat similar. I think traditionally we think of banks as being large institutions with access to lots of resources, being very stable, perhaps more conservative, but for good reason. And I think when you couple those traits with the entrepreneurial spirit of fintechs, it can lead to really incredible outcomes. And so circling back to our topic today on cash flow and it being really the lifeblood of any business, FNBO has partnered with you and Centime to create and develop a tool, a platform to help small and mid-sized businesses better understand, manage, predict, analyze their own cash flows. And so I'll paraphrase Warren Buffett a little bit here. And as he says, cash can be a bit like oxygen. It's easy to forget how important it is until we need it and don't have it. And so with that thought in mind, I'll turn things over to you to talk about the work you've done, the work you're doing now, and to discuss with Dorothy and Todd some of their experiences in managing cash flow for businesses.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate the kind words. And by way of kind of introduction, I'll just tell you that I'm just delighted to be partnered with you with FNBO over the last couple of years. We're here, of course, to talk about what we have been doing together, being a customer-led organization, developing a cash flow management and control solution that enables businesses to really gain more insight over one of the most precious resources that they have, which is cash. I'll just, a little bit of background first to start, right? I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I've started, 4 companies. 3 of them have been fintech companies. And it's there's this media-driven trope that, fintechs and banks are adversarial and one is, the fintechs are out to replace the other. But the reality is that it's a lot more like a relationship where partners can work together to solve real world problems that face that small and mid-sized businesses and customers in general, businesses face. And that's why we're here. I mean, I think banks are amazing entities in the sense that they provide capabilities around deposits, around payments, around credit that are about cash. And fintechs can be thinking outside the box, not regulated, and have the ability to provide solutions that leverage each other's strengths. That's kind of why we're here. What I'd like to do is introduce each of our speakers in turn, each of our participants. But before I do that, obviously, as an entrepreneur, I've run companies myself, and my own story is about how poorly I understood cash flow. Prior to starting Centime, I started a company called Mineral Tree, and Mineral Tree was a company that was backed by venture capital. Fortunate enough to raise capital from venture capitalists in order to run the business. Every 4 to 6 weeks, we had board meetings. And every 4 to 6 weeks, I had the responsibility to stand in front of my board, venture capitalists, very demanding sorts of people, and explain to them what my financials looked like, including my cash flow. And I have to confess that I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand it. And not only did I not understand it, if our board meetings were at 8:30 in the morning, our CFO was sort of pushing formulas around inside his Excel spreadsheet, trying to make it all work. Not because we're trying to cook the books or anything, but it's a cash flow forecast. My investors are going to ask me, how long is your cash going to last? What is your revenues going to look like? What is it? When is your fume date? These were basic questions that they asked, and often it was the case that we didn't really have, neither did we have good answers, nor did we have good data to produce those answers. And this was kind of a very basic pain point I felt like, was helpful to go after and solve. Because it's not just about, I can tell fun stories about how, I did this crazy stuff at, 8:30 in the morning prior to board meetings. But the reality is that, businesses that, do well, that manage cash well, thrive. And businesses that don't pay attention to cash can run the risk of, putting themselves out of work. And I'll tell you this, that, in as much as it is really important, every business at some point grapples with cash flow. You don't have to be a small business with a thin balance sheet, to be worried about cash. You could be Boeing, with the max disaster on your plate, now having to go and get a $20 billion credit line because you can't make payroll. And this is the reality of what happens in every business. And so what we wanted to do today was two things. One is share some stories that, make it real for everybody, because I think we all understand and have all been, at some level at these places where we've had to deal and grapple with cash. And the second is from those stories, really provide for you a sort of a framework, a standardized framework, a formalism, if you will, by which businesses should think about managing and controlling cash flow. We do it today, don't get me wrong. Everybody does it at some level. But how formal is it? How consistent is it? How regularly do we do it? And that's really what I think, we should be able to offer, small businesses the opportunity to do. So 3 parts to this. First, what we're going to do is to introduce our speakers, Dorothy and Todd. Have them tell stories of survival, stories of living to fight another day, stories of joy, And then what we're going to do is to come back to me and spend a little bit of time, a couple of minutes, sharing a framework around the solution that, we think could be beneficial. And then we'll sort of turn it back over to Matt and, enjoy our weekend. So first, let me kind of introduce our first speaker, Dorothy Kolb, who is... I always like to say that being a working mom is the hardest thing in the world. It really is. And, children, I think, tend to gravitate towards mothers first. And it's not only that, it's not just one, but 4. Dorothy has 4 kids, all grown up, and, innumerable, soccer games and basketball games. If that weren't enough, she's also the CEO and founder of her own accounting firm that provides services to other businesses. So she's a mom, she works, she's an entrepreneur, she's a CEO, and she cares about the well-being of her clients. That's a lot to take on. And so, I hope you have some stories to tell today, Dorothy. Over to you.
Thanks, PC. I appreciate that. I think wrangling 4 kids has given me a lot of resources to learn how to wrangle a bunch of clients as well. But you were talking about businesses being in an interesting cash position, and you had talked about the basketball game. So I will give you a really quick example of a client that I worked with, actually a company that I worked with some years ago, who struggled with cash flow. It wasn't managed very well, and often there were different partners in the organization who would withdraw cash from the operating account, and we wouldn't know it was happening because it wasn't on our forecast. And there was one night in
Dorothy, if you don't
particular.
mind, sorry, is it okay if I interrupt from time to time
Of
rudely?
course,
Yeah.
of course.
So, would you tell us a little bit before we dive into this about types of clients you have? How
Oh,
big are these
sure.
firms? Are they Fortune 500 companies? Do you have the singular client that is Walmart?
No, I
Tell
do
us a
not
little.
have a singular client that's Walmart. I work with small to mid-sized businesses. My clients tend to be between $1 million and $10 million a year in revenue, although I do work on occasion with clients who are in the high 6 figures as well. And they are typically in creative agencies, social impact firms, and podcast production companies. But my background is in broadcasting and entertainment. I worked for CBS, NBC, Fox. I've worked with youth sports organizations now as well. So my background is pretty broad as far as what kind of companies I'm used to working with. So I've
I
seen
feel
cash
like
flow from many angles.
feel like we should make a sharp left turn, abandon our original topic, and talk about the media instead. No, 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 no. Just kidding. Just kidding. Let's go.
Yeah, so this one particular company I was working with, it was a Friday night. No joke. I was at a basketball tournament for one of my kids. I was the CFO of the company at the time. I thought I had planned cash accordingly, and got a phone call from my payroll manager saying that we did not have enough money to fund payroll that that was supposed to draw that night for a Monday payroll. And it turned into an absolute panic. It turned into having to reach out to all the partners there were 3 partners in the company, and try to get cash infused in an emergency, and getting all that. Meanwhile, I'm trying to be present at my son's basketball game. You're there for your kid. It's 8 o'clock at night. You want to be watching the game. And instead I'm on the phone panicking, and stressing out between then and Monday morning when payroll came out that it might not people might not get paid. And obviously the last thing you want is your employees to not feel valued, and one of the ways to do that is to not pay them. So it
And
really
don't you also get to go to prison if you miss payroll? I think it's that too.
Yeah, could be. We made payroll. We had cash infused, but of course everybody was just, in a huge panic. But, BC, I like to compare it to, and I know we've talked about this before, I like to compare it to the car gas tank. Might I give that analogy right now? Great. So my gas tank analogy or metaphor, I always get those confused, is that you have a car and you have a gas tank, and you drive home and you put it in the garage and you've got a half a tank, and that's Monday. And that Wednesday you have to drive out to a client meeting, a board meeting, whatever it is, and you need that half tank of gas to get there and back. In the meantime, your wife or your husband or your partner takes the car out, comes back. Your teenage son or daughter takes the car out and comes back. You don't know. You get in it Wednesday morning and it's got an eighth of a tank. And now you can't get to your client meeting without stopping for gas, which of course you haven't left time for. Same thing goes with if you manage your cash by just looking at your bank account on any given morning. If you're just looking at your bank account saying, oh, I've got plenty, and you forget that payroll is going to draw, or that automatic credit card payment's going to draw, and then all of a sudden you realize that you have no cash left or a very little amount left, that comes from not properly forecasting your cash. If you forecast it, if you've got a method for doing that, and you know what levers to pull and push in order to make sure you have enough at any given time, that relieves so much of that stress. And we've all got so much stress in our lives as business owners and entrepreneurs that we don't need the stress of, do I have enough cash in the bank to pay payroll on Thursday morning?
It's a great analogy, and let me build on it, right? Analogy, metaphor, they are overused, and who knows what they really mean, you know. But the point is that your the needle on the gas gauge tells you how much you have. You have something in your head about how long it's going to last, and if you're the singular person that manages your car, then there's no issue whatsoever. But
Right.
as you grow, there are multiple people that want to get their paws onto the steering wheel, and that's really where, like, some of these challenges occur. What do you say to your clients that say, you know what, I don't have a problem, I've got it all in my head, I don't need any solutions, I don't need no stinking solutions, technology sucks anyway?
Yeah. And
you
they're
know
out there, right?
they're out there.
These business owners are out there. I try, we used to use the if I get hit by a bus analogy, which is horribly negative. So now I say, if you win the lottery, on Wednesday and you're like, oh, I'm out of here for the next 3 weeks, I'm going to Bali, whatever. And all that information is in your head. You have now left your business and your employees in the lurch. They have no idea. You have no idea whether or not you can cover what they need. They don't know. And you're leaving this big gap of information. And to have it just in your head is such a disservice to not only your business, yourself, but the people who work for you. And they're really important, obviously, right? And so even if you use an Excel spreadsheet, something that is external from inside your head allows you to get it out there so others can help you with that. So you don't have to carry that stress yourself, so that you know that there are not errors in your calculations in your head. And the relief of stress when you have that information at your fingertips and others do so that they can help you is just enormous.
It's growth, continuity, and scale,
Yes.
right? I mean, it brings me back to Bill Price, who's my CFO. I hope he's not on the call today. Who is pushing these cells around, nobody could ever figure out this Excel spreadsheet other than Bill himself, and only he knew which formula was in which cell, and only he knew how to manage this spreadsheet.
Well, and that's the bad thing about using Excel too, is if we break one formula or leave one thing out of a cell that's 16 columns back, it can materially impact what you're looking at. So if you can use technology that has all that built into the back and you don't have to worry about it, a lot better, right?
So we're not saying anything that people don't know, right? I mean, everybody knows that cash is important, cash flow is important, forecasting is important, right? Everybody, basically what we're saying is do it, but do it in a more scalable way that serves the growth of your organization.
Absolutely. And if the pandemic taught us nothing, it was cash reserves are king.
Exactly. And people, I think that's a really important point, is that, even the best businesses suddenly were impacted by the fact that, business dried up. A lot of times, the cash that you have is the result of receivables that you have, or e-commerce business that you have, that's cash coming in. If that gets disrupted, then there's a real problem. So it's better to sort of at least have some mechanisms in place that allows you to keep track of where things are.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we'd love to hear more horror stories, and I don't mean that lightly, but I do think that, having good humor around these hard problems to solve is, I think, helpful. But I want to turn the conversation over to Todd, who has a slightly different role. And, by way of introduction, let me just say that, when we were prepping for a different, event and webinar, we were doing something similar, and Todd was on camera like I am now. And, over my right shoulder, Todd spied a speaker, and he's like, clearly this guy must be an audiophile. So let me ask him what speaker, he has. And he wrote me an email saying, I'm an audiophile. What was that sort of box behind it? And I was like, too insecure to admit that I was not an audiophile. So I went and looked it up and came up with some technical description of it and turned it over to Todd. So, by way of introduction, you can see he's got all sorts of fancy looking audio equipment in his background. And so, before I turn it over to you, Todd, I have to make sort of trite comments to introduce you. So, you're the CEO. You like the sound of cash more than the sight of it, don't you?
Yes, that is true.
And so, for Todd, comes from a different perspective. So Todd he's a creative guy. He thinks big thoughts. He's been growing his business. The last thing that he delights in is the arcane matter of managing cash. At the same time, I think he recognizes the importance of so doing. So go ahead, Todd, tell us your story.
Thank you, BC. And I appreciate the nod to my audio file. I do recognize that Klipsch 4.2, KG 4.2 you have is a lovely speaker, and it's highly efficient. Well, lets you drive it with a much lower wattage amp. But I know that's not what we're here to talk about today. A couple things. The benefit of going last is that I get to create thoughts as each of you spoke. So thank you for letting me go last. For those who are attending, if you tuned out now, you probably would have gotten 90% of the value from this conversation, because I'm recognizing my role now as with BC, a three-time fintech developer, and Dorothy, an established CFO. I believe I'm playing the role of the village idiot today.
Come on, tell the fact that you're running a 30-year-old company, which is an accomplishment.
A three-act play we're in. Our company is actually 100 years old, and we were started in 1908. And my father acquired the company in 1959, and then I acquired it in 2016. And one thing that occurred to me while Dorothy was speaking on her payroll story was that my father said to me, my father gave me a lot, and he's still alive. He's got more energy than I do, but he gave me one piece of advice. He said, Todd, if you do anything, don't ever miss payroll. And that struck a chord with me because, and at the time I didn't equate it to, I knew it was probably related to cash flow, but I just knew that don't miss payroll. That was an imperative. So the first thing I did after acquiring the company was made sure that I had a significant line of credit in place that I could tie to our payroll checking account, so that if I mismanaged our cash flow, which in all likelihood is probable, at least I wouldn't be trying to wake Dorothy up in the middle of the night to help us infuse cash to cover that payroll. So that's a lesson from my father and kind of where I'm at. The other thought that occurred to me, I think BC was a word you use, and I'm going to use this word as kind of my swing thought. So if there's any golfers that are in attendance today, the books all tell you to have a simple singular swing thought. And that swing thought for me would be around optimizing. When I had the time to play much more golf, I knew trying to maximize my drive was not a sound approach to golfing. Bite your lip, swing as hard as you can. Any golfer will tell you that's not what you want to do. But optimizing the efficiency of your swing is really where the magic of golf can be found. So optimizing rather than maximizing is really a good word for what I've tried to do. But my focus as CEO, and I've been running operations since 1998 and CEO since 2016, is optimizing around the things that I'm good at. My core interests are innovation, development, strategy, office culture. My weaknesses, which are many, but one of them is finance. Now, luckily, I've invested in a company like Dorothy operates, so I can outsource that finance aspect and have someone help me understand what my finances are. But around cash flow, I sadly can admit that I assume that if I run a good company, I can just watch the cash flow. That's, do a good job, get enthusiastic customers that enjoy what you do for them, and the cash will flow. By the way, if there's any new entrepreneurs in the audience, that's not how it works. And I had to learn that lesson in the early 90s, again in the early 2000s, 2008. And then also the pandemic reminded me that there are other things to look out for. So if I am the village idiot today, I can share stories about what it is to be a small business and managing cash flow. Does that optimizing make sense, BC? Is that an okay swing thought?
Absolutely. It is about optimization. And I like the fact that, you're a big man to admit that finance is not a strength. I mean, that's really important. I mean, I am in the same exact place, finance is a necessary element of what we need to do, but not necessarily the most pleasant thing, to think about all the time. And I always like to say, it's an important asset. It needs to be managed. You have to own it. But how can you own it if you don't like it?
Right,
You're not
right.
good at it.
And I think that's so true. And that's so true for me, at least. I can't speak for everyone, but understanding cash flow is something that I've taken a greater interest in since this summer. I was exposed to your product, and much like my product, the similarities to what we do as far as media monitoring for our clients, we provide a dashboard that lets them see their media exposure in a simple to understand way. What's the reach? What's the impact? Things like that. So that lets them plan. And if I can plan when to pay people I owe, if I can plan when I'm going to receive that big annual renewal from one of my largest clients, that helps me know when to invest, when I can develop new projects. And if I can, I might just share a quick horror story that will underscore how ignorant I might be. And before I get started, I'm very excited that I understand cash flow much better today than I did in 1998.
You and me both.
But I don't even want to get into the witchcraft known as the balance sheet. So let's save that for another day. Okay? I took on a large development project, basically to redesign our media monitoring portal. And that required hiring a development company to write new code from the ground up. Rather than paying for that all up front, we were able to make monthly payments on that. A significant monthly payment. And I guess if there's another lesson I learned, this is a second takeaway for you. Never miss a payroll, never pay programming developers upfront. I've learned that lesson. If you pay them upfront, you get to that 80% part and the project never gets finished. But that's another moving on.
I won't be offended. It's okay.
So, in my business, that monthly stroke of the check was significant. And, I'm not so proud to admit that there were a couple timing errors when I paid that amount. And okay, now I have reduced my checking account, my primary checking account that the payroll draws on, to a point where I have to transfer money from my line of credit. Now the income was enough to cover all of my expenses, but the timing was off. I blew the timing. Maybe that's also like golf. If you look up when you're swinging, your timing is going to be off. I never got my handicap much below 17, so I can't claim to be a good golfer either. But that's something I learned. And after 3 or 4 months of really figuring out that, okay, this development check is going to be due for 12 months. I've made a couple errors based on timing. My income is such that I can cover this. I just have to get smarter at watching my cash flow. If I had the ability before starting that payment to predict when my money was going to come in, when my receivables would be highest so I could make that payment, and not make that payment to the developer just after the credit card had been paid and just before payroll was due, I wouldn't have had to learn these lessons the hard way. But I guess if there is any strength of mine, I am teachable. So I learned the lessons and didn't have to call my Dorothy to transfer money in the middle of the night for me.
I think, thank you for the story. I think that, I hope everybody's teachable. Everybody's, got the sort of humility to be able to admit that we can all do better. But also you're highlighting, another element of, a cash flow control management framework that's really important. Dorothy talked about how much cash you have, how long it's going to last, having a forecast. You've waxed eloquent about the fact that it's all about the timing of payables and receivables. You talked about how you drew on your credit line when you needed to. Those 4 things, in my mind, are the things that sort of all need to be brought together in order to more effectively, systematically, consistently manage your cash flow. And so I just wanted to bring it all together into a framework that, I think is should be familiar to everybody, but are the elements of the solution that we have developed with FNBO as a partner. And that'll bring us to the close, and then I'll turn it over to Matt. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen and share that basically abstract into a couple of slides the things that Dorothy you've talked about, and Todd you've talked about, and then we can wrap it up. So please bear with me while I just do that. So effectively, I think what we're saying is that Todd's company and Dorothy's company and her clients there's nothing sort of really unusual about the situations that they find themselves in. Basically every business at some level grapples with cash flow. And first of all, let's get some formal definitions out there and sort of process related issue. Every business spends, right? I mean, you're spending on people, on marketing, on products, on inventory, and then what you do is you build goods and services associated with that. You sell them to customers, and then you get the cash from those receivables. This is what happens with every business. You're usually spending ahead of any cash that you receive. This gap that exists between your cash out and your cash in is what we'll call the cash flow gap, right? The more longer the cash flow gap, the more capital you need on your balance sheet to be able to tide out the times. Obviously, the goal is to reduce the cash flow gap as much as possible, because that's when you have a short cash conversion cycle, you have an efficient business, you produce lots of cash on your balance sheet. So in order to do that, what businesses will try to do is to slow down their payables, speed up their receivables, right? If you can slow down your payables and speed up your receivables, you shorten the cash flow gap, right? But sometimes you just don't have those degrees of freedom. You may not have the volume of payables. You may have a business that needs additional capital to grow. So that's when you tap into credit. Or you might make mistakes, or you might be in situations and circumstances where, hey, I've got this big invoice that is going to be paid by my largest customer 2-3 months from now, but I have payroll to make next week. What do? I've got a timing issue. I might need to tap into some credit to be able to deal with the timing issue. This framework is what we think is a very basic framework that every business deals with. And with that in mind, what we have built is, I'll just quickly run through this, is a solution partnered with FNBO to create what we call cash flow control. And I don't want to spend the rest of like the half an hour now going into details about what the solution is, but just to give you a sense for what the components are. We've built a solution that integrates with the general ledger, provides a way, as Dorothy said, to give you a gas gauge, right? That tells you not only how much cash you have, but information about all the other people who got their paws on that car to tell you what's going to happen to it based on their plans. And then give you the ability to say, what do you got out there in terms of receivables? When is it going to be paid? How is it going to be paid? Who's going to be late? And what is the impact of that late payment on my cash flow, and how can I help control it? The flip side of it is, how do I do to my suppliers what is being done to me? We'll call it strategically manage your payables. Who do I pay? When do I pay? How much do I pay? Can I use a credit card to pay? Can I use a credit line to pay? These are things that are decisions that are made every day. But how do we make it more systematic so that we can put it into the context of a cash flow? And then if those two don't work out, then what happens if I need to borrow? Do I have the capability to be able to tap into a line of credit, so that I can meet my cash goals? These are some of the major components of what I think we've built, along with a comprehensive approach to understanding the risk and reputation of both my buyers and my suppliers. Why am I extending credit terms to my buyers if it turns out that they're not creditworthy? Or do I know whether they're creditworthy or not? How do I find out? Right? So these are basic questions that every business needs to ask. And then finally, how well am I doing? So these are the major components of that reflect the stories that Dorothy and Todd have been telling us, and hopefully those of you that are in the audience can relate to, which is hopefully everybody. But we're excited to tell you more, and that's part of what we wanted to share with you today. And thank you, Matt. Back to you. And basically, I'm sorry if this turned into too much of a product pitch. I felt it would be helpful to at least share with you what I think the opportunity is for people to manage one of the most important assets that they have more effectively, which is cash. Where do you, Matt?
Absolutely. No, thank you, BC, and thank you, Dorothy, and thank you, Todd, for your stories. It was not only informative, but incredibly entertaining. And in kind of preparing for this, I knew Todd was funny, but BC, you were a pleasant surprise. So, but before we let you guys go,
should I be offended by that? I don't know.
Before we let you guys go, and before you get to enjoy your weekend. We do have a couple questions that have come in from our audience. And so the first one up, and I think, Dorothy, I'll start with you because of the work you've done with several businesses. And then Todd, I'd also be interested in your perspective as the CEO of a company and someone that's perhaps less interested in the nitty gritty of the financials. But the question is, why don't businesses do the kind of forecasting that's been discussed here today in regards to cash flow?
I guess I'll take that first then, huh, Matt?
Yeah.
My experience, and perhaps Todd can agree with this or not, but finance and accounting is scary for a lot of people. Just at the basis, just numbers, just trying to wrap their heads around what it means and what does this data mean. And I think the other side of it is that it's also scary if you're not in a great position to own up to that and to say, oh, shoot, yeah, I need to make changes here, and they're going to be uncomfortable. And I think that is probably the biggest block to someone, because they don't want to own that information and own up to it and say, these are the changes and the pivots we're going to have to make. Everybody can manage your cash really well when it's coming in the door and you can't stop it. And, then it becomes more a matter of making sure that you're utilizing the cash that you have properly. And that's a totally different conversation. But I think, it's a scary, uncomfortable place when you have to make decisions that are not fun.
Annual physical is what it reminds you of. Right? I mean, seriously, I think, do you really want to know what's wrong with you? I mean, and I'm not saying that things need to be wrong, but it's always better to know than not know.
Matt, I might answer that if I can continue in my role as the village idiot. It's because I didn't really understand it. I'm an entrepreneur. I own the company. It's privately held. I get 100% of the benefit and 100% of the downside. And so I'm used to being scared or worried or have fear, as Dorothy alluded to, that some people might, those feelings and emotions people might have. But frankly, it's not easy. And I like to focus on the things that I am good at. And if I can just briefly equate what BC said, or what he just showed on the screen, that type of dashboard puts it into a simplified visualization that someone like me can understand. So that's really what changes my approach to cash flow. Is if it's simplified and I can understand it, I will use it, and I will use it for planning. And now I've taken something that I've avoided or didn't understand or pretended like I did and said, yes, cash flow.
AG 4.2. That's the same thing about the speaker.
Right. Now I can talk equally about cash flow as I can about the efficiency of loudspeakers. But simplifying it, I think, is the takeaway word for this. If it's simple, I'll understand it and I'll use it, and now I can plan. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, absolutely does. It's a unique perspective given all of our unique backgrounds and strengths that we bring to any given table, and being able to admit perhaps where we have a weakness and where perhaps we need a tool to be able to up our game to some extent in that area. So last question here, and then we'll wrap up. And BC, I think given your history in the creation and formation of a few companies now, how can cash flow control and support growth and innovation?
Well, to some extent, the answer is the same, right? I mean, I think a lot of times what happens is that I'll give you my personal experience. All the companies I've started have been companies that have been venture backed. And one of the luxuries that, if you can use that word, that a venture backed company has is that you've got, capital that has been invested in, put on your balance sheet by venture investors. It's not debt, it's equity capital, right? But it's very expensive capital. And you want to stretch it as much as possible. You want to build a business that, has more net cash flow than a business that taps into the growth equity, the capital that has been sort of invested in your company by venture investors. The good news is there's capital out there for guys like me. The bad news is it's very expensive. So from my standpoint, as an entrepreneur, what I'd like to do is to ensure, and I have this, by the way, I have this newfound sense of knowledge and maturity only now, right? I didn't have this like, 2 years ago when it comes to understanding cash flow. I mean, now I can say, oh my God, I want to make sure that I run a business where the payables and receivables function in a certain way. My contracts, produce cash in a certain way so that I can continue to sort of produce net cash flow rather than burning the capital that I've raised from my investors, because that's expensive. That to me is the growth story. How can I use my cash flow to grow? I do that by understanding what it is and predicting it and knowing how to manage the timing of my payables and receivables and the investments that I make in people to make that happen.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you all again for your time today. And thank you to our audience for tuning in today. Business Insights will be back beginning in 2022. We'll have a market update with our Chief Investment Officer, Kurt Spieler, and that will be followed with a discussion with our Business Owner Advisory Services team and a discussion on business succession planning. So with that, thanks again to everyone and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the chance to do that.